14-year-old boy kills his baby sister, shows no remorse, until the judge destroys his ego. 14 years old. That's how young he was when he sat in that interrogation room, texting on his phone like nothing had happened. His baby sister was gone, 8 months old, and he couldn't even look up from his screen. When detectives asked him what happened, he shrugged. When they showed him the evidence, he smirked. He believed his age made him untouchable. He thought the world would never hold him accountable. But there was a judge waiting for him, a judge who had seen monsters before, and when their eyes finally met in that courtroom, the boy's arrogance would crumble into dust. He just didn't know it yet. Stories like this remind us that justice always finds its way. If you believe in accountability, subscribe now and share your thoughts in the comments below. Let us know what you think should happen to someone like him. This is how it all began. It was a quiet Tuesday morning in a suburb where nothing bad ever happened. The kind of neighborhood where children rode bicycles on tree-lined streets and neighbors waved at each other over white picket fences. The Patterson family had lived there for nearly a decade. To everyone who knew them, they seemed like the picture of normalcy. A hard-working mother, a father who traveled for business, a teenage son who got decent grades. And then, 8 months ago, the family welcomed their newest member, a baby girl named Lily. She had her mother's eyes and a laugh that could light up any room. For a brief moment, everything seemed perfect. But behind closed doors, something dark was growing, something no one could see. And by the time anyone noticed, it would already be too late. The Patterson home sat at the end of Maple Drive, a 2-story colonial with a freshly painted porch and a garden that bloomed every spring. From the outside, it looked like a sanctuary. Inside, it told a different story. Sarah Patterson worked double shifts at the local hospital, leaving before dawn and returning after dark. Her husband, Michael, spent most of his time on the road, chasing promotions that never seemed to come. And their son, Ryan, was left alone more often than any 14-year-old should be. He didn't complain. In fact, he seemed to prefer it that way. The emptiness of the house gave him room to breathe, room to think, room to become someone nobody recognized. When Lily was born, the family dynamic shifted in ways no one anticipated. Suddenly, all the attention that once belonged to Ryan was redirected toward the crying infant in the nursery. His mother cooed over every tiny sound the baby made. His father, on his rare visits home, spent hours rocking Lily to sleep instead of asking Ryan about school or his friends. The boy noticed. He noticed everything. At first, he masked his resentment with silence. He would sit at the dinner table, pushing food around his plate, watching his parents fawn over the baby like she was the only thing that mattered. And slowly, that silence turned into something colder, something that festered in the shadows of his mind. Ryan was not the kind of teenager who caused obvious trouble. He didn't get into fights at school or talk back to his teachers. In fact, most people who met him found him charming. He had a way of smiling that made adults trust him, and a calm demeanor that fooled nearly everyone. His guidance counselor once described him as mature beyond his years. His neighbors thought he was polite and helpful, but there were cracks beneath the surface, small moments that hinted at something darker. A classmate remembered him twisting the arm of a younger student when he thought no one was watching. Another recalled finding a dead bird in his locker, placed there like some kind of trophy. Nobody connected the dots. Nobody thought to look closer. At home, the warning signs were even harder to see. Ryan played the role of the dutiful older brother when his parents were around. He would offer to watch Lily while his mother rested. He would smile and wave at the baby monitor like he was the perfect sibling. But when the doors closed and the lights dimmed, his behavior changed. He would stand over Lily's crib for long periods, staring down at her with an expression no one ever witnessed. He wrote things in his journal that would later send chills down the spines of investigators. Fantasies about control, thoughts about what it would feel like to hold someone's fate in his hands, and always, always a simmering jealousy that he could never quite extinguish. The week before everything changed, Ryan's behavior grew stranger. He stopped eating meals with the family. He started locking his bedroom door for hours at a time. His mother noticed, but chalked it up to teenage moodiness. His father was too busy packing for another business trip to pay attention. Only the neighbor across the street, an elderly woman named Mrs. Chen, sensed something was wrong. She saw Ryan standing in the backyard one evening, perfectly still, staring at nothing. When she waved, he didn't wave back. He just turned turned and walked inside like she wasn't even there. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself teenagers were strange, but something in her gut told her otherwise. Lily, meanwhile, was blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around her. She was the kind of baby who smiled at everyone and everything. Her laugh was infectious, a high-pitched giggle that could melt the coldest heart. She had just learned to crawl and spent her days exploring every corner of the living room, grabbing at toys and squealing with delight. Her grandmother visited every Sunday and called her a little angel. Her mother took hundreds of photographs, documenting every milestone like it was a miracle. In a house full of growing tension, Lily was the only source of light. She was innocent, she was loved, and she had no idea that her own brother was watching her with something far darker than affection. On the morning of October 17th, Sarah Patterson kissed her daughter goodbye and headed to work. She reminded Ryan to keep an eye on the baby until the afternoon babysitter arrived. He nodded without looking up from his phone. She hesitated at the door, feeling something she couldn't name, a heaviness in the air, a whisper of wrongness, but she pushed it aside. She was already running late. She blew one last kiss toward the nursery and disappeared into the early morning fog. She had no way of knowing that when she returned, her entire world would be shattered, and the boy she trusted to protect her daughter would be waiting in the hallway with blood on his hands. Maple Drive had always been the kind of street where people felt safe. Children played basketball in driveways until the streetlights came on. Families gathered for block parties every 4th of July. Doors were left unlocked, and strangers were greeted with warm smiles. It was the kind of neighborhood that existed in postcards and old movies, untouched by the chaos of the outside world. The Patterson family had chosen it specifically for that reason. When Sarah was pregnant with Ryan 14 years ago, she and Michael drove through dozens of communities before finding this one. It felt like home the moment they saw it. They never imagined that the greatest danger to their family wouldn't come from outside. It was already living under their roof. Baby Lily had become the heartbeat of the household in just 8 short months. She was born on a snowy February morning, arriving 3 weeks early but perfectly healthy. From her first breath, she commanded attention. Her eyes were wide and curious, always scanning the room like she was trying to memorize every detail. She rarely cried, which the doctors said was unusual for a newborn. Instead, she cooed and gurgled, filling the house with sounds that made everyone smile. Her grandmother knitted her a pink blanket that she carried everywhere. Her grandfather built her a wooden rocking horse he promised she would ride one day. Lily was surrounded by love from the moment she entered the world. She was a gift none of them knew they needed. Sarah often said that Lily saved her marriage. The years before the baby arrived had been difficult. Michael's constant traveling created distance between them. Ryan's teenage withdrawal added to the strain. There were nights when Sarah sat alone in the kitchen, wondering if the family was falling apart. But when Lily came, everything changed. Michael started taking fewer trips. He would sit in the nursery for hours, singing lullabies he made up on the spot. Sarah felt a renewed sense of purpose, a reason to keep the household together. Even Ryan seemed to soften at first. He held his baby sister carefully, like she was made of glass. He let her tiny fingers wrap around his thumb. For a few precious weeks, it seemed like Lily had brought them all back together. But that hope didn't last. As the months passed, Ryan's initial curiosity toward his sister turned into something else. He stopped volunteering to hold her. He started leaving the room whenever she cried. At first, Sarah assumed it was normal sibling adjustment. Many teenagers struggled when a new baby arrived. She bought Ryan books about being an older brother. She tried to spend one-on-one time with him on weekends, but nothing seemed to work. He became more distant, more secretive, more unreachable. When she asked him what was wrong, he would shrug and say nothing. When she pushed harder, he would disappear into his room and lock the door. The boy she once knew was slipping away, and she didn't know how to bring him back. Ryan's school life painted a different picture. To his teachers and classmates, he was the same charming kid he had always been. He participated in class discussions and turned in his assignments on time. He sat with the popular crowd at lunch and laughed at all the right jokes. Nobody suspected that anything was wrong. His English teacher even praised him for a creative writing assignment about family bonds. She had no idea that the same hands that wrote those beautiful words would soon commit an unthinkable act. Ryan had learned early how to wear masks. He knew exactly which version of himself to show to the world, and he kept his darkest thoughts locked away where no one could find them. The days leading up to October 17th were filled with small moments that would later haunt everyone who witnessed them. Mrs. Chen noticed Ryan sitting on the porch alone, staring at the street with empty eyes. A classmate saw him searching something on his phone during lunch and quickly hiding the screen. The family babysitter mentioned that Ryan asked strange questions about how long she would be gone that week. None of these details meant anything on their own, but together they formed a pattern that pointed towards something no one wanted to believe. A 14-year-old boy was quietly unraveling, and the only person who couldn't see it was the mother who trusted him most. On the night before the tragedy, Sarah tucked Lily into her crib and whispered a prayer she had said every night since the baby was born. She asked for health, for happiness, for a long and beautiful life. Lily smiled up at her, reaching for her mother's face with chubby fingers. Sarah kissed her forehead and turned on the nightlight shaped like a crescent moon. She walked past Ryan's room and saw the light under his door. She thought about knocking but decided against it. He needed his space. She went to bed believing that tomorrow would be just another ordinary day. She had no way of knowing that by the time the sun set again, her baby would be gone, and her son would be sitting in a police car, showing no emotion at all. The morning of October 17th began like any other. Sarah woke before the sun, showered quickly, and poured coffee into a travel mug she had used for years. She checked on Lily one last time, watching the gentle rise and fall of her tiny chest beneath the pink blanket. The baby was peaceful, dreaming whatever dreams infants dream. Sarah smiled and whispered goodbye, promising to be home before dinner. She reminded Ryan about the babysitter's arrival time and told him there was food in the refrigerator. He barely looked up from his phone, offering only a mumbled acknowledgement. She hesitated at the door for a moment, feeling that strange heaviness again, but her shift was starting soon. She pushed the feeling aside and left. The babysitter, a college student named Emma, was supposed to arrive at noon. She had been watching Lily for 3 months and adored the little girl, but that morning Emma's car wouldn't start. She called Sarah and left a voicemail explaining she would be 30 minutes late. Sarah was in surgery and didn't receive the message until hours later. Those 30 minutes would become the most important half hour in the entire investigation, because during that window, Ryan was completely alone with his baby sister. No witnesses, no supervision, just a teenager, an infant, and whatever darkness had been building inside him for months. By the time Emma finally arrived, it was already too late. Emma knew something was wrong the moment she stepped through the front door. The house was too quiet. Lily was usually babbling or crying by midday, filling the rooms with her presence, but there was only silence, a thick, suffocating silence that made Emma's skin prickle. She called out for Ryan, but no one answered. She walked toward the nursery, her footsteps echoing on the hardwood floor. The door was slightly open. She pushed it wider and stepped inside. What she saw made her scream so loud that Mrs. Chen heard it from across the street. The crib was disturbed. The pink blanket was on the floor, and Lily was lying motionless, her tiny body too still to be sleeping. Emma's hands shook as she dialed 911. Her voice cracked as she tried to explain what she was seeing. The operator told her to check for breathing, to start infant resuscitation, to stay calm. But Emma couldn't stay calm. She had babysat dozens of children over the years, and she had never seen anything like this. The operator dispatched paramedics immediately, their sirens cutting through the quiet suburban afternoon within minutes. Neighbors emerged from their homes, drawn by the flashing lights and the chaos unfolding at the Patterson residence. Mrs. Chen stood on her porch, clutching her chest, remembering the strange look in Ryan's eyes just days before. She prayed she was wrong about what she was thinking. Paramedics rushed into the nursery and immediately began working on Lily. They moved with practiced urgency, their training taking over even as their hearts broke. But their efforts were futile. The baby showed no signs of life. The lead paramedic looked at his partner and shook his head slowly. Time of death would later be estimated at approximately 11:45 that morning, just 15 minutes before Emma arrived. 15 minutes that separated life from death. 15 minutes that a teenage boy had used to commit an act so terrible that even seasoned investigators would struggle to comprehend it. The nursery, once filled with lullabies and laughter, had become a crime scene. Police arrived shortly after the paramedics. They secured the perimeter and began documenting everything. Detectives noted the position of the crib, the displaced blanket, the small smears on the railing that would later be confirmed as blood. A forensic team dusted for fingerprints while another officer reviewed the security camera footage from the living room. The camera didn't capture the nursery directly, but it showed something equally damning. It showed Ryan walking toward the nursery at 11:32 and emerging at 11:47. His expression was calm, calm. His movements were unhurried. He walked to the kitchen, poured himself a glass of juice, and sat down to scroll through his phone. He didn't call for help. He didn't check on his sister again. He simply waited. When detectives finally located Ryan, he was sitting in the hallway near the back door. His posture was relaxed, almost bored. There was a small smudge on his right hand that he hadn't bothered to wash off. When an officer asked him what happened, he shrugged and said he didn't know. When they asked why he didn't call for help, he said he thought the baby was sleeping. His answers were short and emotionless, delivered with the casual indifference of someone discussing the weather. The lead detective, a 20-year veteran named Harold Simmons, had interviewed hundreds of suspects in his career, but something about this boy made his blood run cold. There was no fear in Ryan's eyes, no guilt, no humanity, just a hollow emptiness that seemed to swallow all the light in the room. Detective Simmons knew right then that this case would haunt him forever. Detective Harold Simmons had been with the department for 2 decades. He had seen every kind of criminal imaginable: gang members who killed for territory, husbands who snapped after years of resentment, addicts who committed unspeakable acts for their next fix. But in all his years, he had never sat across from someone like Ryan Patterson. The boy was 14 years old, barely old enough to drive, yet he carried himself with the cold composure of a seasoned convict. When Simmons entered the interrogation room, Ryan didn't flinch. He didn't ask for his parents or a lawyer. He simply looked up with those empty eyes and waited. It was as if he had been expecting this moment his entire life. The interrogation room was small and sparse, designed to make suspects uncomfortable. A metal table sat in the center, bolted to the floor. 2 chairs faced each other beneath a single fluorescent light that hummed with an annoying frequency. Ryan sat with his hands folded on the table, his posture relaxed. He had been offered water and declined. He had been read his rights and acknowledged them with a nod. Now he waited for the questions to begin, his expression betraying nothing. Detective Simmons studied him for a long moment before speaking. He had learned over the years that silence could be more powerful than words, but Ryan seemed immune to the pressure. He simply stared back, patient and unblinking. Simmons began with simple questions. What time did you wake up this morning? What did you have for breakfast? When did your mother leave for work? Ryan answered each one with minimal words and no emotion. Yes, cereal, early. He offered nothing more than what was asked, revealing neither guilt nor innocence. When Simmons shifted to questions about Lily, Ryan's demeanor remained unchanged. He said he heard her crying around 11 and went to check on her. He said she seemed fine when he left the room. He said he didn't know what happened after that. Every answer was delivered with the same flat tone, as if he were reciting lines from a script he had memorized long ago. But the evidence told a different story. While Simmons conducted the interrogation, forensic technicians were combing through the Patterson home with meticulous precision. They found fingerprints on the crib railing that matched Ryan's. They discovered a small tear in the baby's blanket consistent with a forceful grip. Most damning of all, they recovered the security footage that showed Ryan entering and exiting the nursery during the critical window. The timestamp was undeniable. He was in that room for 15 minutes. 15 minutes during which no one else entered or left. When confronted with this evidence, Ryan's response chilled everyone in the room. He tilted his head slightly and said maybe the camera was wrong. The forensic team also examined Ryan's phone, which he had surrendered without protest. What they found painted a disturbing portrait of a troubled mind. His search history revealed queries about infant vulnerabilities and methods of harm that made investigators physically ill. His text messages showed conversations with online acquaintances about testing limits and feeling powerful. One message, sent just 3 days before the incident, read simply, "I wonder what it feels like to control everything." The recipient had responded with laughing emojis, assuming it was a joke. But there was nothing funny about what Ryan had done. Every piece of digital evidence pointed toward premeditation. This was not an accident. This was not a momentary lapse in judgment. This was something far more sinister. Sarah Patterson arrived at the police station 2 hours after the investigation began. She had received the call during her shift and nearly collapsed on the hospital floor. A colleague drove her to the station because her hands were shaking too violently to hold a steering wheel. When she saw the police cars and the yellow tape surrounding her home, she screamed her daughter's name over and over until her voice gave out. Officers had to physically restrain her from running inside. They sat her in a patrol car and tried to explain what had happened, but the words didn't make sense. months. Her baby was gone. Her son was a suspect. Her entire world had crumbled in the span of a single morning. She kept asking why, but no one could give her an answer. Michael Patterson flew home on the first available flight, arriving late that evening. He found his wife in the hospital, sedated and surrounded by family members who didn't know what to say. He found his home surrounded by police tape and investigators in white suits. And he found his son in a juvenile detention facility awaiting formal charges. When Michael demanded to see Ryan, the officers hesitated. They warned him that the evidence was overwhelming. They told him to prepare for the worst. But Michael refused to believe it. This was his son, the boy he had taught to ride a bicycle, the boy he had taken to baseball games. There had to be some mistake. There had to be another explanation. It wasn't until he saw the security footage himself that the denial finally cracked. His boy had walked into that nursery with purpose and emerged without remorse. The father who had missed so many moments of his son's life now wished he had missed this one too. Detective Simmons worked through the night, piecing together a timeline that would eventually be presented in court. Every detail mattered. Every second counted. He interviewed neighbors, teachers, and classmates, building a behavioral profile that grew more disturbing with each conversation. A pattern emerged of a boy who wore masks, a boy who manipulated everyone around him, a boy who had been hiding in plain sight for years. By dawn, Simmons had enough evidence to recommend charges, but something still nagged at him, something in the way Ryan had sat so calmly in that interrogation room. The boy wasn't scared of being caught. He wasn't worried about punishment. It was almost as if he wanted to be seen, as if this whole nightmare was just the beginning of a performance only he understood. The digital forensics team worked in a windowless room filled with computer monitors and the hum of processing machines. They had cloned Ryan's phone within hours of his arrest and begun the painstaking process of extracting every piece of data it contained. Text messages, browser history, app usage, location tracking. Every digital footprint the boy had left behind was now laid bare for investigators to examine. What they discovered over the next 48 hours would transform this case from a family tragedy into something far more calculated. Ryan Patterson had not acted on impulse. He had been researching, planning, and fantasizing about this moment for weeks. The digital evidence was irrefutable, and it painted a portrait of a mind that had gone terribly wrong. His browser history alone was enough to disturb even the most hardened investigators. In the weeks leading up to October 17th, Ryan had searched for terms that no 14-year-old should know. He researched infant anatomy and vulnerabilities. He looked up cases of children who had harmed siblings and studied what sentences they received. He visited forums where troubled individuals shared dark thoughts without consequence. One search, conducted just 4 days before Lily's death, asked a simple question: how long does it take? The investigators didn't need context to understand what he meant. They printed every search result, every timestamp, every click. By the time they finished, they had over 200 pages of digital evidence that would later be presented to the court. Ryan's text messages revealed another layer of his hidden life. He had been communicating with anonymous users on encrypted apps, sharing thoughts he never expressed out loud. In one conversation, he described feeling invisible in his own home. In another, he talked about wanting to be remembered for something significant. A recurring theme emerged across multiple chats: the idea of control. Ryan was obsessed with it. He wrote about how powerless he felt when his parents focused on the baby. He fantasized about situations where he held all the power. One message, sent to an unknown recipient 3 weeks before the incident, read, "What if I did something no one could ignore?" The response was a single word. Like what? Ryan never answered. He didn't need to. He was already making plans. While the digital team worked, Detective Simmons and his partner conducted interviews throughout the community. They spoke with Ryan's teachers, who described him as intelligent and well-behaved. They talked to his classmates, who said he was popular and easy to like. But beneath the surface praise, darker anecdotes emerged. One student recalled Ryan cornering a smaller boy in the locker room and whispering threats that made the child cry. Another remembered finding disturbing drawings in Ryan's notebook, images of figures lying motionless on the ground. A former friend admitted that Ryan had once killed a neighbor's cat and showed no reaction when confronted. Each story added another piece to the puzzle. The charming teenager everyone thought they knew was a carefully constructed facade hiding something monstrous underneath. The psychological profile that emerged was textbook antisocial behavior. Experts who reviewed the evidence noted classic signs of conduct disorder, a condition characterized by persistent patterns of aggression, deceitfulness, and violation of rules. Ryan displayed superficial charm, which he used to manipulate those around him. He showed a profound lack of empathy, evidenced by his calm demeanor after the crime. He demonstrated premeditation and planning, suggesting an organized and calculating mind. The forensic psychologist who compiled the initial assessment wrote that Ryan exhibited traits commonly associated with emerging psychopathy. It was a clinical term, but it carried enormous weight. This was not a troubled child who made a terrible mistake. This was a predator in the making. The search of Ryan's bedroom uncovered the most chilling evidence of all. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard under his bed, investigators found a journal that Ryan had clearly never intended anyone to see. The pages were filled with meticulous handwriting, documenting his thoughts over several months. Early entries expressed frustration and jealousy. He wrote about feeling replaced by Lily, about his parents forgetting he existed, but as the pages progressed, the tone shifted. The frustration became cold calculation. He began writing what he called experiments, small tests of boundaries to see what he could get away with. He described pinching the baby when no one was looking. He wrote about how easily he could make her cry and how satisfying it felt. The final entry was dated October 16th, the night before the tragedy. It contained only 2 sentences. "Tomorrow, I find out who I really am. No one will ever ignore me again." Detective Simmons read the journal 3 times before he could speak. He had seen evil before, but rarely so clearly documented by the perpetrator's own hand. Every page was a confession, a roadmap of a mind descending into darkness. When he showed the journal to the district attorney, she went pale. They had enough evidence to charge Ryan as a juvenile, but the premeditation suggested something more serious. Discussions began about whether to try him as an adult. It was a controversial decision, fraught with legal and ethical implications. But the journal made one thing undeniably clear. This was not a spontaneous act of violence. This was methodical. This was planned. And the boy who committed it had shown no remorse whatsoever. As Simmons closed the journal and placed it into evidence, he muttered, words that would echo through the entire prosecution. "This goes beyond a bad day. He planned every second of it." Ryan Patterson spent his first night in juvenile detention staring at the ceiling of his cell. The facility was designed for minors awaiting trial, a sterile environment of concrete walls and locked doors meant to impress upon young offenders the gravity of their situations. Most teenagers who arrived there were terrified. They cried for their parents. They begged for second chances. They promised to change if only someone would let them go home. But Ryan did none of these things. He lay on his thin mattress with his hands folded behind his head, perfectly calm, as if he were spending the night at summer camp rather than a detention center. The guards who checked on him every hour found his composure unsettling. One veteran officer later testified that in 30 years of working with juvenile offenders, he had never seen a child so utterly unbothered by his circumstances. The court appointed a psychologist named Dr. Eleanor Vance to evaluate Ryan before his preliminary hearing. Dr. Vance had spent 2 decades studying adolescent criminal behavior and had testified in dozens of high-profile cases. She had encountered manipulative teenagers before. She had sat across from young offenders who lied with practiced ease. But her first session with Ryan left her genuinely unnerved. He walked into her office with a polite smile and shook her hand like they were meeting at a social function. He answered her initial questions with charm and apparent openness. He expressed appropriate sadness about his sister's death, but something was wrong. His words said one thing, while his eyes said another. There was a disconnect between his performance and his reality that Dr. Vance recognized immediately. She had seen it before in adults diagnosed with severe personality disorders. Seeing it in a 14-year-old was deeply troubling. During their sessions, Ryan demonstrated a remarkable ability to shift personas depending on what he thought Dr. Vance wanted to see. When she asked about his childhood, he played the role of a neglected son desperate for parental attention. When she inquired about his feelings toward Lily, he pretended to be a grieving brother struggling with guilt. When she pushed harder, probing for inconsistencies, he became defensive and accused her of trying to trap him. Each mask slipped seamlessly into the next, a performance so polished that Dr. Vance wondered how long he had been practicing. She showed him photographs of Lily during one session, watching his face for any genuine emotional response. There was none. His eyes remained flat and disinterested, scanning the images like they were pictures in a textbook. When she asked what he felt when he looked at his sister, he paused for exactly 2 seconds before responding with textbook grief. It was calculated, it was rehearsed, and it confirmed her worst suspicions. Dr. Vance's preliminary report was devastating. She documented Ryan's lack of genuine remorse, his manipulative behaviors, and his inability to form authentic emotional connections. She noted that he displayed grandiose thinking, believing himself smarter than the adults around him. He showed contempt for authority figures while simultaneously charming them to get what he wanted. Most concerning of all, he demonstrated a complete absence of empathy. When Dr. Vance asked him to imagine what his mother was feeling, he shrugged and said she would get over it eventually. When she asked if he understood that his sister was gone forever, he nodded but showed no emotional weight behind the acknowledgement. Her clinical conclusion was stark. Ryan Patterson exhibited traits consistent with conduct disorder with callous and unemotional features, a precursor to antisocial personality disorder. Without significant intervention, she warned, he posed a high risk of reoffending. The Patterson family was given an opportunity to visit Ryan before his preliminary hearing. Sarah had barely slept since the tragedy. She had aged years in a matter of days, her face gaunt and her eyes hollow from crying. Michael accompanied her, still clinging to the desperate hope that some explanation would emerge to exonerate their son. When they entered the visitation room and saw Ryan sitting calmly at a metal table, neither parent knew what to say. Sarah broke the silence first, her voice cracking as she asked him why. Why did he do it? Why didn't he call for help? Why was he sitting there like nothing had happened? Ryan looked at her with an expression that resembled sympathy but carried no warmth. He told her that he didn't know what she was talking about. He said that whatever happened to Lily wasn't his fault. He insisted that the police had made a mistake, and when Sarah collapsed into sobs, he watched her cry without reaching out to comfort her. Michael's reaction was different. Where Sarah crumbled, Michael erupted. He slammed his hands on the table and demanded that Ryan tell the truth. He invoked years of memories, baseball games and birthday parties and family vacations, trying to reach whatever humanity might still exist inside his son. But Ryan remained unmoved. He met his father's rage with cold indifference, occasionally glancing at the clock on the wall as if bored by the confrontation. When Michael finally exhausted himself and slumped back in his chair, Ryan spoke in a voice devoid of emotion. He said that none of this was his problem. He said that his parents should have paid more attention to him. He said that maybe if they had been better parents, none of this would have happened. It was the first glimpse of the entitlement and blame shifting that would later define his courtroom behavior, and it shattered whatever hope his parents still held. The guards escorted Ryan back to his cell while his parents sat in stunned silence. Sarah couldn't reconcile the boy she had raised with the stranger who had just blamed her for her daughter's death. Michael replayed every moment of Ryan's childhood, searching for signs he had missed, warnings he had ignored. They held each other in the parking lot and wept for both their children, the baby who was gone and the son who had become someone they didn't recognize. Dr. Vance's words echoed in their minds: high risk of reoffending, absence of empathy, traits consistent with emerging psychopathy. They had created this child together. They had fed him, clothed him, loved him, and somehow, despite everything, they had raised a monster. The question that would haunt them for the rest of their lives was simple and unanswerable. How had they not seen it coming? The journal found beneath Ryan's floorboard became the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. District Attorney Michelle Torres had handled difficult cases before, but reading those pages kept her awake at night. The entries began innocuously enough, complaints about school and frustrations with homework that could have been written by any teenager. But as the months progressed, the tone darkened into something unrecognizable. Ryan wrote about feeling superior to his classmates, describing them as sheep who couldn't see how special he was. He mocked his teachers for believing his performances. He fantasized about being famous, about having his name known throughout the world. The journal revealed a narcissism so profound that it bordered on delusion. Ryan didn't just believe he was smart smarter than everyone around him. He believed he was untouchable. The most disturbing entries documented what Ryan called his experiments. These were small tests designed to see how much he could get away with before someone noticed. He wrote about stealing money from his mother's purse and watching her blame the cleaning lady. He described lying to his father about school events that never happened just to see if anyone would check. He recounted manipulating classmates into doing his homework by threatening to spread rumors about them. Each successful deception reinforced his belief that he was operating on a level beyond ordinary people. The experiments escalated over time, becoming bolder and more dangerous. The final experiments involved Lily. He wrote about making her cry when no one was watching. He documented how easy it was to hurt something so small and defenseless, and he expressed disappointment that no one ever suspected him. It was as if he wanted to be caught, just to prove how clever he had been. Prosecutor Torres shared the journal with Detective Simmons, and together they mapped the progression of Ryan's mindset. They highlighted passages that demonstrated premeditation and underlined phrases that showed his complete disregard for consequences. One entry, written just 2 weeks before Lily's death, stood out among the rest. Ryan had written about legacy and how most people lived and died without anyone remembering their names. He expressed contempt for ordinary existence and wondered what it would take to become truly unforgettable. The final sentence of that entry sent chills down the spine of everyone who read it. Maybe I need to do something that no one can ignore. It wasn't a confession, but it was close. It showed that Ryan had been building towards something catastrophic for months. The tragedy wasn't a sudden explosion, it was the inevitable conclusion of a slow and deliberate descent. Ryan's manipulation tactics became apparent during his continued interactions with investigators and court officials. He quickly learned which behaviors earned sympathy and which ones drew suspicion. When speaking with his defense attorney, he played the role of a frightened child overwhelmed by circumstances beyond his control. When dealing with detention staff, he was polite and cooperative, earning privileges that other detainees didn't receive. But his mask slipped when he thought no one was watching. A security camera in the detention facility captured him laughing to himself after a particularly emotional phone call with his mother. A guard overheard him mocking another detainee for crying about missing his family. Each incident was documented and added to the growing file that Torres was building. Ryan believed he was outsmarting everyone. He didn't realize that his own arrogance was providing the prosecution with everything they needed. The emotional toll on the Patterson family was immeasurable. Sarah had taken a leave of absence from the hospital, unable to focus on anything except the dual nightmare of losing her daughter and discovering who her son really was. She attended therapy sessions twice a week, but found little comfort in the process. How do you grieve a child while simultaneously grappling with the fact that your other child is a murderer? There was no guidebook for this kind of pain. Michael handled his grief differently, throwing himself into work and avoiding the house where both children had lived. He couldn't walk past Lily's nursery without breaking down. He couldn't look at photographs of Ryan without feeling rage and sorrow in equal measure. Their marriage, already strained before the tragedy, began to fracture under the weight of unanswerable questions. They blamed themselves, they blamed each other, and underneath it all, they blamed the boy who had torn their family apart without a shred of remorse. The preparation for trial forced the family to confront evidence they wished they had never seen. Prosecutor Torres met with Sarah to prepare her for testimony, walking her through the photographs, the journal entries, and the security footage she would need to acknowledge in court. Sarah broke down completely during the session. She couldn't understand how the boy who used to draw her pictures and beg for bedtime stories had become capable of such horror. Torres was gentle but firm. She explained that the jury needed to see the real Ryan, not the charming mask he wore in public. They needed to understand that his lack of remorse wasn't an act. It was who he truly was. Sarah nodded through her tears and promised to testify. It was the only thing she could still do for Lily, and she would not let her baby down again. Dr. Vance submitted her final psychological evaluation the week before trial. Her conclusions were unequivocal. Ryan Patterson displayed a persistent pattern of callous and unemotional traits that placed him at extremely high risk for future violent behavior. He demonstrated no genuine remorse for his actions and showed sophisticated manipulation skills well beyond his years. His narcissism and grandiosity suggested he viewed himself as exempt from normal rules and consequences. Most troubling was his apparent lack of attachment to any human being, including his own family. Dr. Vance recommended intensive long-term intervention in a secure facility, warning that standard juvenile rehabilitation would be wholly inadequate. She concluded her report with a single sentence that would echo through the courtroom: "Without significant intervention, Ryan Patterson will harm again." man." The prosecutor read those words and knew exactly how to end her opening statement. "Your arrogance," she would tell the boy who thought himself untouchable, "will meet its match in this court." The day of the trial arrived under heavy gray skies that seemed to mirror the mood of everyone involved. News vans lined the street outside the courthouse, their satellite dishes pointed toward the clouds like mechanical flowers seeking sunlight that would never come. Reporters stood in clusters, rehearsing their segments and speculating about what would unfold inside. The case had captured national attention in ways that small towns rarely experience. A 14-year-old accused of killing his infant sister, a family torn apart by unimaginable tragedy, a defendant who reportedly showed no remorse. The story had all the elements of a true crime sensation, and the media descended accordingly. By the time the courthouse doors opened, a line of spectators stretched around the block, all desperate to witness justice served. Ryan Patterson was escorted into the courtroom through a side entrance reserved for defendants. He wore a navy blue suit that his defense attorney had chosen specifically to make him appear younger and more sympathetic. His hair was neatly combed, and his face was clean-shaven. He looked like any ordinary teenager heading to a school function, not a murder suspect facing the possibility of decades behind bars. As he took his seat at the defense table, he scanned the room with an expression of casual interest, as if he were observing a play rather than participating in his own trial. When his eyes met his mother's across the gallery, he offered a small smile that made Sarah's stomach turn. It was the same smile he had given her 1,000 times before, but now she saw it for what it truly was, a mask designed to manipulate. The Honorable Judge Patricia Whitmore entered the courtroom at precisely 9 o'clock. She was a woman in her early 60s with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that had witnessed decades of human depravity. She had presided over hundreds of criminal trials and earned a reputation for fairness tempered with an unwillingness to tolerate nonsense. Defense attorneys feared her because she could see through manipulation instantly. Prosecutors respected her because she demanded excellence and accepted nothing less. As she took her seat at the bench and surveyed the courtroom, her gaze lingered on Ryan for a long moment. He met her eyes without flinching, a faint smirk playing at the corners of his lips. It was the first of many mistakes he would make in her presence. Judge Whitmore noted the expression and said nothing. She didn't need to. The gavel would speak loudly enough when the time came. Prosecutor Michelle Torres rose to deliver her opening statement with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. She approached the jury box slowly, making eye contact with each of the 12 citizens who would decide Ryan's fate. She spoke in measured tones, painting a picture of an innocent baby whose life was stolen by the one person who should have protected her. She described the evidence that would be presented, the fingerprints, the security footage, the disturbing journal entries that revealed months of planning. She talked about a defendant who showed no remorse, who blamed his parents for his own actions, who viewed himself as above consequence. And she promised the jury that by the end of this trial, they would see Ryan Patterson for exactly who he was. Not a misguided child, not a victim of circumstance, but a calculating predator who had coldly and deliberately ended the life of an 8-month-old baby. The gallery was silent when she finished. Several jurors wiped tears from their eyes. The defense attorney, a veteran named Gregory Hayes, offered a different narrative. He acknowledged the tragedy of Lily's death, but urged the jury to consider the complexities of adolescent psychology. He spoke about a troubled teenager from a broken home, neglected by workaholic parents, and left to raise himself. He suggested that whatever happened in that nursery was the result of untreated mental illness rather than malicious intent. He asked the jurors to remember that Ryan was only 14 years old, barely old enough to understand the consequences of his actions. It was a compelling argument, delivered with practiced sincerity, but it rang hollow in the face of the evidence that would soon be presented, and Ryan himself undermined it completely. Throughout Hayes' statement, the boy fidgeted in his seat, rolled his eyes at key moments, and whispered dismissively to his attorney. The jury noticed. Judge Whitmore noticed. Everyone noticed except Ryan, who remained blissfully unaware that his own arrogance was destroying his best chance at leniency. The first confrontation between Ryan and Judge Whitmore came sooner than anyone expected. During a brief recess, Ryan was overheard making a sarcastic comment about the proceedings to his attorney. The remark carried further than he intended, reaching the ears of a bailiff who reported it immediately. When court resumed, Judge Whitmore addressed the defendant directly. Her voice was calm, but carried an edge that silenced the entire room. She reminded Ryan Ryan that he was facing serious charges in a court of law and that his behavior would be observed and noted throughout the trial. She warned him that any further displays of disrespect would result in consequences he would not enjoy. Ryan listened with an expression of forced contrition, nodding at appropriate intervals. But when the judge turned away, that familiar smirk crept back across his face. He still believed he was the smartest person in the room. He still thought he could perform his way to freedom. He had no idea how wrong he was. The afternoon session began with the prosecution calling its first witnesses. Paramedics who responded to the scene described finding Lily unresponsive in her crib. Their voices cracked as they recounted the futile efforts to revive her. Police officers detailed the evidence collected from the nursery, the fingerprints and blood smears that placed Ryan at the scene during the critical window. A forensic analyst explained the security footage frame by frame, showing the jury exactly when Ryan entered the room and when he emerged. Throughout these testimonies, Ryan maintained an air of detached indifference. He examined his fingernails during the paramedic's tearful account. He yawned audibly when the forensic analyst presented her findings. Each gesture was noted by the jurors, who exchanged glances of disbelief and disgust. Judge Whitmore watched it all with an expression that revealed nothing. But inside, she was already forming the words she would deliver when the time came. As the first day of trial drew to a close, Judge Whitmore addressed the courtroom one final time. She summarized the proceedings and reminded the jury of their duty to remain impartial. Then she turned to Ryan, who was already gathering his things to leave. Her voice stopped him cold. She asked a simple question that hung in the air like a verdict waiting to be spoken. "Young man, do you understand the gravity of what you are accused of?" Ryan paused and turned to face her. For a moment something flickered in his eyes, a hint of the fear he had been suppressing since his arrest. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the mask he wore so well. He nodded slowly and said yes, but his tone was dismissive, almost mocking. Judge Whitmore held his gaze for a long moment before responding. "We shall see," she said quietly. Then she struck her gavel and adjourned for the day. The sound echoed through the courtroom like a warning of things to come. The second day of trial began with the presentation of evidence that would leave no room for doubt. Prosecutor Torres had organized her case with meticulous precision, building toward the most damning revelations one layer at a time. The morning session opened with a forensic analyst who walked the jury through the physical evidence recovered from the nursery. Enlarged photographs were displayed on a screen for the courtroom to see. Fingerprints lifted from the crib railing matched Ryan's exactly. Blood smears on the wooden bars were confirmed to belong to Lily. The analyst explained each finding in clinical detail, translating scientific terminology into language the jury could understand. By the time she finished, the connection between Ryan and the crime scene was irrefutable. There was no unknown intruder. There was no accident. There was only a teenage boy and his baby sister, alone in a room where something terrible had occurred. The security footage was played next, projected onto a large screen that everyone in the courtroom could see. The timestamp read 11:32 when Ryan appeared in the frame, walking casually toward the hallway that led to the nursery. His body language was relaxed, unhurried, as if he were simply going to check on a sleeping infant. The footage showed him disappearing from view for exactly 15 minutes. When he reappeared at 11:47, his demeanor was unchanged. He walked to the kitchen, poured a glass of juice, and sat down at the table with his phone. There was no urgency in his movements, no indication that anything was wrong. The prosecutor paused the footage on a frame that showed Ryan scrolling through his phone, his expression blank and unconcerned. She let the image linger for a long moment before addressing the jury. "This is a boy who had just left his dying sister alone in her crib," she said quietly, "and he sat down to check his messages." The afternoon brought testimony that shifted the emotional weight of the trial entirely. Sarah Patterson was called to the stand, and the courtroom fell silent as she made her way forward. She looked fragile, diminished by grief in ways that were visible to everyone present. Her hands trembled as she placed them on the witness stand. Her voice cracked before she even spoke her first word. Prosecutor Torres guided her gently through the testimony, asking about Lily's birth, her personality, the joy she brought to the household. Sarah described her daughter's laugh, the way she reached for faces, the sound of her babbling in the morning. She talked about the dreams she had for Lily's future, the milestones that would never be reached, the life that was stolen before it truly began. By the time she finished, there was not a dry eye in the gallery. Even several jurors jurors were openly weeping. Ryan's behavior during his mother's testimony was observed by everyone in the courtroom. While Sarah poured out her grief, he sat with his arms crossed and his eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance. He showed no reaction when she described Lily's first smile. He remained unmoved when she recounted the moment she learned her daughter was gone. At one point, he leaned over to whisper something to his attorney, apparently amused by something only he could see. The jury watched him with growing horror. This was a boy listening to his mother's heartbreaking, and he couldn't even pretend to care. Judge Whitmore observed as well, her expression revealing nothing but her eyes missing nothing. She had seen defendants try to appear remorseful and fail, but she had rarely seen one so completely indifferent to the suffering of his own family. The grandparents testified next, their words carrying the weight of generations of love now tinged with unspeakable loss. Lily's grandmother described the pink blanket she had knitted, how the baby clutched it every night before sleep. Her grandfather talked about the rocking horse he had built, still waiting in the corner of his workshop for a child who would never ride it. Neighbors spoke about the Patterson family before the tragedy, painting a picture of suburban normalcy shattered by violence. Each testimony added another layer to the portrait of Lily as a real person, not just a victim in a case file. She had been loved, she had been cherished, and she had been taken by someone who should have protected her. The cumulative effect was devastating. By the end of the afternoon, the prosecution had established not only what was lost, but who was responsible for losing it. Judge Whitmore called for a brief recess after the family testimonies concluded. The emotional weight in the courtroom had become almost unbearable, and even the jurors needed time to compose themselves. Ryan was escorted to a holding room where he would wait until proceedings resumed, but before he left, something happened that would be discussed for the remainder of the trial. As he passed the gallery where his mother sat weeping, Ryan paused and looked directly at her. His expression was not one of guilt or sorrow, it was annoyance. He rolled his eyes slightly, as if her grief were an inconvenience rather than a response to his actions. A court reporter caught the moment and noted it in the record. Judge Whitmore saw it too. When proceedings resumed, she addressed Ryan directly, reminding him that his conduct was being observed and that the court would not tolerate disrespect toward witnesses or victims. Ryan nodded without expression, but the damage was already done. Dr. Eleanor Vance was called to provide expert testimony about Ryan's psychological profile. She approached the stand with the calm authority of someone who had testified in dozens of trials. Prosecutor Torres walked her through her credentials, establishing her expertise in adolescent psychology and criminal behavior. Then the questioning turned to Ryan specifically. Dr. Vance described her sessions with the defendant, noting his superficial charm, his manipulative tendencies, and his profound lack of empathy. She explained the significance of callous and unemotional traits in adolescence and what they predicted for future behavior. She talked about his narcissism, his grandiosity, his belief that he was somehow exempt from normal rules, and she concluded with her professional assessment. Ryan Patterson posed a significant risk for future violence if not subjected to intensive, long-term intervention. The jury listened in rapt attention. When she finished, Torres nodded slowly. "Dr. Vance," she said, "you've described who Ryan Patterson is. Tomorrow, the world will see his true thoughts." She glanced toward the evidence table where a worn journal sat waiting. His own words will condemn him. The third day of trial opened with a palpable tension that filled every corner of the courtroom. Word had spread about what was coming, and the gallery was packed tighter than before. Spectators who couldn't find seats stood along the walls, their faces drawn with morbid anticipation. The journal that had been discovered beneath Ryan's floorboard would finally be read aloud. His own words, written in his own hand, would be presented to the jury for all to hear. Prosecutor Torres had prepared extensively for this moment, selecting passages that demonstrated premeditation while remaining within the bounds of what the court would allow. She understood the power of letting a defendant condemn himself. There was no witness more compelling than the accused speaking in his own voice, and Ryan had provided her with more than enough material to destroy any remaining sympathy the jury might have felt. Torres approached the evidence table and lifted the worn notebook with something approaching reverence. She held it up for the jury to see, explaining how it was discovered, where it was hidden, and what it contained. Then she began to read. The first passage was dated 3 months before Lily's death. In it, Ryan complained about feeling invisible in his own home. He described his parents as oblivious fools who didn't deserve his respect. He wrote about his baby sister with undisguised contempt, calling her a parasite that had stolen everything that mattered. The words hung in the silent courtroom like poison spreading through clean water. Jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Several gallery members covered their mouths in shock, and Ryan sat motionless at the defense table, his expression revealing nothing as his private thoughts became public knowledge. The passages grew darker as Torres continued reading. One entry described Ryan's first experiment with Lily, a moment when he pinched her arm while their mother was in another room. He wrote about the satisfaction of hearing her cry, the thrill of knowing he had caused it, the disappointment when no one suspected him. Another entry detailed his observations of the baby's vulnerabilities, clinical assessments of how fragile she was and how easy it would be to hurt her. He wrote about testing boundaries, pushing limits, seeing how far he could go before someone noticed. The journal revealed a mind that viewed other people as objects to be manipulated rather than beings deserving of empathy. It showed a teenager who had been practicing cruelty in small doses, building toward something catastrophic, and it documented his complete lack of remorse with chilling clarity. The final entries were the most damaging of all. Torres read from the page dated October 16th, the night before Lily's death. Ryan had written about feeling ready, about knowing what he needed to do, about wondering what it would feel like to hold absolute power over another life. He speculated about whether he would feel different afterward, whether the world would finally see him for who he truly was. The last sentence was simple and devastating. "Tomorrow I find out who I really am." Torres closed the journal and faced the jury. She let the silence stretch for a long moment before speaking. "These are not the words of a confused child," she said quietly. "These are the words of someone who planned to kill, and then did exactly that." She returned the journal to the evidence table as if it were contaminated by the thoughts it contained. Throughout the reading, Ryan's composure began to show its first visible cracks. He had clearly not expected his journal to be discovered, and hearing his private thoughts read aloud in open court was affecting him in ways he hadn't anticipated. His posture stiffened, his jaw tightened, his eyes darted around the room as if searching for an escape route that didn't exist. When Torres read the passage about his experiments with Lily, his hands gripped the edge of the defense table so hard that his knuckles went white. For the first time since the trial began, the mask was slipping. The confident smirk that had defined his courtroom presence was nowhere to be seen. In its place was something that looked almost like fear. The jury noticed, Judge Whitmore noticed, everyone noticed except Ryan, who was too consumed by his own internal turmoil to realize how completely exposed he had become. The digital evidence presented next reinforced everything the journal had revealed. Prosecutor Torres called a forensic computer analyst to the stand, who detailed the contents of Ryan's phone and computer. Search histories were displayed on the courtroom screen, showing queries that made several jurors physically recoil. Ryan had researched infant vulnerabilities, suffocation methods, and famous cases of children who had harmed siblings. He had visited forums where disturbed individuals shared violent fantasies without consequence. He had saved articles about young murderers, studying their cases as if preparing for his own. The analyst also presented text messages between Ryan and anonymous online contacts, conversations in which he fantasized about power and control, about being remembered for something significant, about crossing lines that normal people feared. Each piece of evidence added another brick to the wall the prosecution was building. By the time the analyst finished, Ryan's claims of innocence had been reduced to rubble. Photographs of Lily were displayed next, a deliberate choice by the prosecution to remind the jury of the human cost of Ryan's actions. The screen showed images of a smiling baby with bright eyes and chubby cheeks. Lily at her christening, dressed in white lace. Lily on her grandmother's lap, reaching for the camera. Lily in her crib, clutching the pink blanket she would later be found beneath. Each photograph was accompanied by silence so profound that the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Sarah Patterson wept openly in the gallery. Even Michael, who had maintained stoic composure throughout most of the trial, wiped tears from his eyes. The jury stared at the images with expressions of profound sadness. They were being asked to deliver justice for this child, and the weight of that responsibility was visible on every face. When the final photograph faded from the screen, Torres turned to face Ryan. "This is who you took from the world," she said. "An innocent baby who never had a chance to grow up." Ryan looked away, unable to meet her gaze. Judge Whitmore called for a brief recess as the morning session concluded. Before dismissing the court, she addressed Ryan directly with words that carried the weight of her decades on the bench. She asked him if he understood that the evidence presented was overwhelming. She asked if he comprehended the gravity of what he had had done, and then she asked a question that seemed to catch everyone off guard. "Is there anything you wish to say to this court before we proceed further?" The courtroom fell silent. Ryan's attorney leaned over to whisper urgently in his ear, no doubt advising him to remain silent, but Ryan hesitated. For one long moment it seemed as though he might actually speak, might finally offer some explanation or expression of remorse. His mouth opened slightly, his eyes flickered with something unreadable. Then the moment passed. He shook his head and said nothing. Judge Whitmore nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. "Very well," she said. "We shall continue." The gavel fell, and the morning session ended with Ryan's silence echoing louder than any words could have. The afternoon session resumed with testimony that would finally explain how Lily had died. The courtroom had heard about fingerprints and security footage, about journals and text messages, about a teenager who showed no remorse. But the medical evidence had been saved for last. A deliberate choice by the prosecution to ensure the jury understood exactly what Ryan had done to his baby sister. Dr. Marcus Webb, the county's chief medical examiner, took the stand. With the composed demeanor of someone who had testified in countless trials, he carried a folder containing autopsy findings that would be difficult for anyone to hear. Torres approached him slowly, knowing that the next few minutes would be among the most challenging of the entire trial. The truth of Lily's final moments was about to be revealed. Dr. Webb began by describing the condition of Lily's body when she arrived at the medical examiner's office. He spoke in clinical terms, careful to maintain professional detachment while conveying the horror of what he had found. There were bruises on the infant's torso, consistent with forceful handling. There was evidence of pressure applied to the chest and face. The pattern of injuries suggested a sustained assault rather than a single moment of violence. He explained that the cause of death was traumatic asphyxiation, a clinical way of saying that Lily had been unable to breathe because someone had prevented her from doing so. The attack had lasted several minutes, long enough for a baby to struggle, long enough for her tiny body to fight for air that would never come, long enough for the person responsible to understand exactly what they were doing. The courtroom absorbed this information in stunned silence. Several jurors closed their eyes as if trying to block out the images that Dr. Webb's testimony conjured. Sarah Patterson had to be escorted from the gallery when the medical examiner described the pressure marks found on her daughter's face. Her sobs echoed through the hallway long after the doors closed behind her. Michael remained in his seat, his face a mask of controlled anguish, forcing himself to hear every word. He needed to know what his son had done. He needed to understand the full extent of the horror that had occurred in his own home. When Dr. Webb concluded his testimony, the silence that followed was absolute. No one moved, no one spoke. The weight of Lily's suffering hung over the courtroom like a shroud that would never lift. The defense attempted to mount a response, but their arguments fell flat against the mountain of evidence. Gregory Hayes called a psychiatrist who suggested that Ryan might have experienced a dissociative episode, a break from reality that would explain his lack of memory and remorse. But under cross-examination, Torres dismantled this theory with surgical precision. She pointed to the journal entries that demonstrated planning. She referenced the search history that showed research and preparation. She asked the psychiatrist if dissociative episodes typically lasted for months and involved detailed documentation. The expert had no satisfying answer. Hayes also tried to emphasize Ryan's difficult home life, the absent father, the overworked mother, the sudden arrival of a sibling who consumed all available attention. But this argument only served to confirm what the prosecution had already established. Ryan had killed Lily because he was jealous, because he wanted attention, because he believed the world revolved around him and resented anyone who suggested otherwise. Judge Whitmore had observed the proceedings with characteristic patience, allowing both sides to present their cases fully before intervening. But as the defense's arguments grew increasingly desperate, her tolerance began to wear thin. When Hayes suggested that Ryan was simply a misunderstood teenager who needed therapy rather than punishment, the judge raised her hand to pause the proceedings. She removed her glasses and addressed the defense attorney directly. Her voice was calm, but carried an authority that silenced every whisper in the room. She reminded him that the evidence presented showed clear premeditation. She noted that the defendant had shown no genuine remorse throughout the entire trial, and she observed that the defense's attempts to shift blame onto the victim's parents were not only ineffective, but deeply inappropriate. Hayes flushed red and apologized. Ryan shifted uncomfortably in his seat, realizing for perhaps the first time that his carefully constructed defenses were crumbling. The prosecution called one final witness before resting its case. Emma, The babysitter who had discovered Lily's body returned to the stand to provide testimony that she had been too traumatized to give during the investigation's early days. She described arriving at the Patterson home and sensing immediately that something was wrong. She talked about the silence, the stillness, the feeling of dread that gripped her before she even reached the nursery. She recounted opening the door and seeing Lily motionless in her crib, the pink blanket crumpled beside her, and she described finding Ryan afterward, sitting calmly in the hallway, scrolling through his phone as if nothing had happened. Her voice broke as she recalled asking him what was wrong with the baby. His response had haunted her ever since. He had looked up with empty eyes and shrugged. "I don't know," he said. "Maybe she stopped breathing or something." Then he had returned to his phone. Emma's testimony painted the final portrait of a teenager utterly devoid of human connection, capable of ending a life and resuming his day without missing a beat. Judge Whitmore addressed Ryan directly as the prosecution rested its case. Her words were measured, but carried an undercurrent of barely contained anger. She told him that she had presided over hundreds of trials and encountered defendants of every kind. She had seen genuine remorse and calculated performance. She had witnessed the full spectrum of human behavior when confronted with the consequences of wrongdoing. But in all her years on the bench, she had rarely encountered someone so young who displayed such complete indifference to the suffering of others. She reminded him that a baby was dead because of his actions. She pointed out that his own mother could barely remain in the courtroom without collapsing. And she concluded with words that would echo through the remainder of the proceedings. "You have toyed with lives long enough," she said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "This court will not be toyed with." Ryan's face went pale. For the first time since the trial began, genuine fear flickered in his eyes. The jury was dismissed to begin deliberations, and Ryan was escorted from the courtroom with none of the arrogance that had defined his earlier appearances. The walls were closing in, and he finally knew it. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. In complex criminal trials, such a short deliberation typically signals one of two things. Either the jury was deeply divided and gave up trying to reach consensus, or the evidence was so overwhelming that there was nothing left to debate. In Ryan Patterson's case, it was unquestionably the latter. The 12 citizens who had sat through days of testimony, who had seen the security footage and heard the journal entries read aloud, who had watched a teenage defendant roll his eyes while his mother wept, did not need long to reach their conclusion. When word spread through the courthouse that a verdict had been reached, the hallways filled with spectators, journalists, and family members who had been waiting for this moment. The courtroom doors opened, and the final act of this tragedy began. Ryan was escorted back into the courtroom with visible reluctance. The confidence that had characterized his earlier appearances was entirely absent now. His shoulders slumped slightly. His eyes avoided contact with anyone in the gallery. He took his seat at the defense table and stared at his hands, which trembled almost imperceptibly against the polished wood. His attorney leaned over to whisper reassurances, but Ryan didn't seem to hear them. He was finally beginning to understand that his carefully constructed world of manipulation and control was about to collapse entirely. The jury filed in one by one, their faces revealing nothing. They took their seats and waited for Judge Whitmore to speak. The silence in the courtroom was so complete that the sound of breathing seemed amplified, each exhale a countdown toward the inevitable. Judge Whitmore entered the courtroom with the gravity the moment demanded. She surveyed the assembled crowd, her gaze lingering on Sarah Patterson, who sat in the front row with tears already streaming down her face. Michael sat beside her, his hand gripping hers with white-knuckled intensity. The grandparents were there too, aging visibly under the weight of grief no family should have to bear. On the other side of the gallery, a handful of Ryan's former classmates had come to witness the outcome, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and morbid curiosity. Judge Whitmore acknowledged the jury foreman with a slight nod and asked whether a verdict had been reached. The foreman, a middle-aged woman with graying hair and kind eyes hardened by what she had witnessed, rose slowly from her seat. "We have, Your Honor," she said. The courtroom held its breath. The verdict was read aloud in a voice that carried to every corner of the room. "Guilty." The word fell like a hammer, echoing off the walls and settling into the bones of everyone present. Ryan flinched as if struck, his composure finally shattering into something that resembled genuine shock. His attorney placed a hand on his shoulder, but Ryan shook it off. He stared at the jury with an expression of betrayal, as if he couldn't comprehend how 12 strangers could see through the masks he had worn so carefully. Sarah collapsed against Michael's shoulder, sobbing with a mixture of grief and relief that defied easy categorization. Justice had been named, but it could never restore what was lost. Lily was still gone. Their son was still a murderer. The verdict changed the legal landscape, but left the emotional terrain as devastated as before. Before sentencing could be determined, the court allowed victim impact statements from the family. Sarah had prepared something to read, but when she approached the podium, her hand shook so violently that the paper rattled audibly. She stood in silence for a long moment, gathering what remained of her strength. Then she began to speak in a voice that cracked with every sentence. She talked about the daughter she would never see grow up. She described the empty nursery that she couldn't bear to enter, the untouched toys, the photographs that now felt like relics from another lifetime. She spoke directly to Ryan, asking questions she knew he would never answer. Why did you do it? How could you hurt something so innocent? Did you ever love her at all? Ryan refused to meet her eyes, staring instead at a point on the floor as if hoping it would swallow him whole. Michael's statement was shorter, but no less devastating. He spoke about the dual loss his family had suffered, a daughter taken by violence and a son revealed to be a stranger. He described the guilt that consumed him daily, the questions about what he might have done differently, the sleepless nights replaying every interaction he ever had with Ryan. He addressed the court rather than his son, unable to look at the boy who had destroyed their family. We tried to give him everything, Michael said, his voice breaking, and somehow it wasn't enough. Or maybe it was too much. I don't know anymore. All I know is that my baby girl is gone, and the person who killed her used to ask me to read him bedtime stories. He returned to his seat without looking at Ryan, who had begun to fidget nervously, his fingers tapping against his thigh in a rhythm that betrayed his mounting anxiety. Judge Whitmore announced that sentencing arguments would proceed immediately, given the severity of the case and the public interest in its resolution. Prosecutor Torres rose first, approaching the bench with the measured confidence she had displayed throughout the trial. She outlined the factors that warranted the maximum possible sentence: the premeditation evidenced by the journal entries, the complete absence of remorse, the psychological evaluations that predicted future violence if Ryan were not confined. She argued that society deserved protection from someone who had demonstrated such profound disregard for human life. She invoked Lily's memory one final time, displaying a photograph of the smiling baby on the courtroom screen. This child had a right to grow up, Torres said quietly. She had a right to take her first steps, to speak her first words, to experience the world that was stolen from her. The defendant took all of that away, and he has shown no indication that he understands or cares about the magnitude of what he did. The defense made its final plea for leniency, arguing that Ryan's age should be a mitigating factor. Hayes emphasized the potential for rehabilitation, citing studies about adolescent brain development and the capacity for change. He acknowledged that Ryan had done something terrible, but insisted that throwing away a young life would serve no constructive purpose. It was a competent argument, delivered with professional skill, but it was hopelessly inadequate against the weight of evidence that had been presented. Judge Whitmore listened with an expression that revealed nothing. When Hayes concluded, she nodded slowly and announced that she would deliver her sentencing decision. The courtroom fell silent. Ryan leaned toward his attorney and whispered something that several observers would later recall hearing clearly. "It can't be that bad," he said, a last desperate flicker of the arrogance that had defined him. "I'm only 14. His attorney said nothing. He knew better. Judge Patricia Whitmore rose from her seat with deliberate slowness, her robes settling around her like the vestments of judgment itself. The courtroom had grown so silent that the faint hum of the overhead lights seemed deafening. Every eye was fixed on her as she arranged her notes on the bench and surveyed the assembled crowd one final time. Her gaze swept across the gallery, pausing briefly on Sarah and Michael Patterson, whose faces bore the indelible marks of grief that would never fully heal. It moved to the jury box, where 12 citizens sat with expressions of solemn duty fulfilled. And finally, it settled on Ryan Patterson, who sat rigid in his chair, his facade of indifference finally crumbling under the weight of what was about to happen. Judge Whitmore removed her glasses, cleaned them methodically, and replaced them on her face. Then she began to speak. "Before I deliver my sentencing decision," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed courtroom, "I want to address the defendant directly." Ryan's head snapped up, his eyes widening slightly as he realized that the moment he had been dreading had arrived. Judge Whitmore fixed him with a gaze that seemed to pierce through every mask he had ever worn. "Ryan Patterson, you have sat in this courtroom for days, displaying an arrogance that I have rarely witnessed in my decades on the bench. You have rolled your eyes during testimony about your sister's death. You have smirked while your mother wept. You have whispered and fidgeted and conducted yourself as though these proceedings were beneath your concern." She paused, letting each word sink into the silence. "I want you to understand something. This court sees you. This court has always seen you, and your contempt for these proceedings has not gone unnoticed." Ryan's attorney placed a cautionary hand on his arm, but Ryan seemed frozen, unable to look away from the judge who was systematically dismantling his remaining defenses. Judge Whitmore continued, her tone measured but implacable. "The evidence presented in this trial has been overwhelming. Your own journal documents months of planning and escalating cruelty. Your search history reveals a fascination with violence that no child should possess. The security footage shows you entering your sister's nursery and emerging 15 minutes later only to sit down and scroll through your phone while she lay dying, and throughout all of this, you have shown not a single moment of genuine remorse." She shook her head slowly, as if the weight of what she was saying exhausted her. "You have attempted to manipulate this court, just as you manipulated everyone else in your life. But manipulation only works on those who cannot see through it. I see through it, Ryan. I have seen through it from the moment you smirked at me on the first day of this trial." The gallery remained utterly still as Judge Whitmore outlined the factors she had considered in reaching her decision. She spoke about the premeditation evidenced by Ryan's journal, the calculated nature of the crime, the complete absence of empathy or remorse. She discussed the psychological evaluations that painted a portrait of a deeply disturbed individual with a high risk of future violence. She acknowledged the defense's arguments about adolescent development and rehabilitation potential, but noted that such arguments were undermined by the defendant's own behavior throughout the trial. "A defendant who cannot even pretend to feel remorse," she observed, "is not a defendant who can be trusted with the opportunity for early release." Ryan's face had gone pale, his earlier confidence replaced by a dawning horror as he began to understand that his age would not protect him. Judge Whitmore turned to address the broader question of justice that cases like this inevitably raised. "When a child commits an act of violence," she said, "society faces a profound dilemma. We believe in the possibility of redemption. We believe that young minds can change, that troubled youth can become productive adults, that the mistakes of adolescence need not define an entire life. These are good beliefs, rooted in hope and humanity." She paused, her expression growing harder. "But these beliefs have limits. Some acts are so heinous, so calculated, so devoid of human compassion that they demand consequences commensurate with their severity. The murder of an 8-month-old infant by her own brother is such an act. This was not a moment of passion or confusion. This was not a tragic accident. This was a deliberate, premeditated assault on the most vulnerable and innocent member of your family, and it was carried out by someone who has demonstrated through word and deed a complete inability to appreciate the value of human life." Ryan had begun to shake visibly, his hands gripping the edge of the defense table with desperate intensity. His attorney whispered something in his ear, but the words seemed to pass through him without registering. For the first time since his arrest, the reality of his situation was crashing down upon him with full force. The smirk was gone. The eye rolls were gone. The dismissive posture was gone. In their place was a terrified 14-year-old who was finally beginning to understand that actions had consequences, that masks could be stripped away, that the world would not bend to his will simply because he believed himself special. Judge Whitmore watched this transformation with an expression that contained neither satisfaction nor sympathy. She was simply observing the inevitable result of choices that Ryan himself had made. The judge then addressed the Patterson family directly, acknowledging the impossible position they had been placed in. "No sentence I deliver can restore your daughter to you," she said gently. "No words can heal the wound that has been inflicted upon your family. You have lost not one child but two, Lily to to violence, and Ryan to whatever darkness consumed him. I cannot imagine the burden you carry, and I will not pretend that justice can make you whole." Sarah wept quietly, Michael's arm around her shoulders. The grandparents clutched each other's hands. Even the seasoned journalists in the gallery seemed moved by the raw humanity of the moment. Judge Whitmore allowed a moment of silence before continuing. "But what I can do is ensure that the person responsible for this tragedy is held accountable. What I can do is protect other families from experiencing what you have experienced. And what I can do is send a message that such acts will not be tolerated by civilized society." She turned back to Ryan, her voice taking on a weight that seemed to press down upon the entire courtroom. "Ryan Patterson, you have been found guilty of the murder of your infant sister, Lily Patterson. You committed this crime with premeditation and malice, showing a complete disregard for human life and a total absence of remorse. You have demonstrated through your own writings and behaviors that you view other people as objects to be manipulated rather than beings worthy of compassion and respect." She paused, and in that pause, the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Ryan's eyes were wide, his earlier arrogance replaced by naked terror. Judge Whitmore leaned forward slightly, her gaze boring into him with an intensity that made him flinch. "Do you understand why this court cannot ignore what you have done?" she asked. Ryan opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He nodded weakly, his defiance finally and completely broken. "Do you understand why society must be protected from those who would prey upon the innocent?" Another weak nod. The judge held his gaze for a long moment before delivering her final words. "Then perhaps, at last, you are beginning to understand the gravity of your actions." Judge Whitmore straightened the papers before her and prepared to deliver the sentence that everyone in the courtroom had been waiting for. The moment seemed to stretch into eternity. Each second waited with anticipation and dread. Ryan sat motionless at the defense table, his earlier trembling replaced by a stillness that suggested shock rather than composure. His attorney had stopped whispering reassurances, recognizing that no words could soften what was coming. In the gallery, the Patterson family clung to each other as if afraid that separation would cause them to shatter entirely. Journalists held their pens poised above their notebooks, ready to capture the words that would define the conclusion of this tragedy. Judge Whitmore took a deep breath, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "Ryan Patterson, having been found guilty of murder in the first degree, I hereby sentence you to the maximum term allowed under juvenile jurisdiction, with a mandatory review for transfer to adult facilities upon reaching the age of 18. The words fell upon the courtroom like stones dropped into still water, their impact spreading outward in waves of reaction. Ryan's head dropped forward, his chin nearly touching his chest, as the full reality of his situation finally penetrated the walls of denial he had constructed. He would spend years behind bars, potentially decades if the review resulted in transfer to an adult facility. The childhood he had squandered, the freedom he had taken for granted, the future he had assumed would bend to his will, all of it was gone, stripped away by his own actions and his own choices. The smirk that had defined him was now less than a memory. Judge Whitmore was not finished. She outlined the specific terms of the sentence with meticulous precision. Ryan would be confined to a maximum security juvenile correctional facility where he would receive intensive psychological intervention. He would be prohibited from contact with his family unless they specifically requested otherwise. He would be subject to regular evaluations to assess his risk level and potential for rehabilitation. And when he turned 18, his case would be reviewed to determine whether he should be transferred to an adult prison to serve the remainder of his sentence. The judge made clear that this review would take into account his behavior during confinement, his response to treatment, and any evidence of genuine remorse. "The door to redemption is not closed," she said, "but you have made it extraordinarily heavy to open. The work of proving yourself worthy of society's trust again begins now, and it will not be easy." The gavel came down with a sound that echoed through the courtroom like thunder. Final, irrevocable, complete. Ryan flinched at the impact, his body jerking as if the wooden hammer had struck him physically. Two bailiffs approached the defense table, their movements practiced and efficient. They lifted Ryan Ryan from his chair and secured his hands behind his back with restraints that clicked shut with cold finality. For the first time since the trial began, Ryan looked toward his parents in the gallery. His eyes, which had been so empty throughout the proceedings, now glistened with something that might have been tears. His lips moved silently, forming words that no one could hear. Whether he was asking for forgiveness or simply saying goodbye, it was impossible to know. Sarah watched her son being led away, her hand reaching out involuntarily before falling back to her side. She had lost both her children now, one to death and one to justice. The courtroom began to empty slowly, spectators filing out with the subdued movements of people who had witnessed something that would stay with them forever. Journalists hurried to file their stories, their fingers already flying across phone screens as they crafted headlines that would spread the news across the nation. The jury members departed quietly, their duty fulfilled, but their hearts clearly heavy with the weight of what they had been asked to do. The grandparents supported each other as they walked toward the exit, their aging bodies bent with grief that seemed too enormous for any frame to carry. Only Sarah and Michael remained in their seats, unable or unwilling to move, staring at the empty space where their son had sat moments before. The courtroom that had been so full of tension and anger now felt hollow, a stage stripped of its players. Outside the courthouse, the reaction was immediate and intense. News of the verdict spread through social media within minutes, sparking debates about juvenile justice, parental responsibility, and the nature of evil itself. Commentators weighed in from every angle, some arguing that the sentence was too harsh for a 14-year-old, others insisting it wasn't harsh enough for someone who had shown such calculated cruelty. Vigils were organized for Lily, her smiling face displayed on posters held by strangers who had never met her but felt connected to her tragedy. The Patterson family's private nightmare had become a national conversation, their grief dissected and analyzed by millions of people who would never understand what it truly felt like to lose a child to violence inflicted by another child. Back in the empty courtroom, Judge Whitmore sat alone at her bench, the silence pressing in around her. She had delivered thousands of sentences in her career, but this one would linger differently. A 14-year-old boy with a brilliant mind corrupted beyond recognition, an 8-month-old baby whose life had barely begun before it was extinguished, a family destroyed by forces they never saw coming. She removed her glasses and rubbed her eyes, feeling every one of her 62 years. Justice had been served, but justice was cold comfort in the face of such profound tragedy. She gathered her papers and rose to leave, pausing at the door to look back at the empty room one final time. Tomorrow there would be another trial, another defendant, another family seeking answers that the law could only partially provide. But tonight she would go home and hold her own grandchildren a little tighter, and she would pray that no other family would ever have to endure what the Pattersons had endured. In the house on Maple Drive, the nursery remained exactly as it had been on the day Lily died. The pink blanket still lay crumpled beside the crib. The mobile of stars and moons still hung motionless above where she had slept. The photographs on the wall still showed a baby girl who would never age beyond 8 months. Sarah had been unable to enter the room since that terrible morning, and Michael had been too afraid to disturb anything that still held traces of his daughter's presence. They would have to face it eventually. They would have to pack away the clothes that would never be worn, the toys that would never be played with, the future that would never unfold. But not tonight. Tonight they sat in their darkened living room, surrounded by a silence that would never quite be filled. The gavel had fallen. Justice had spoken. But nothing would ever bring their baby back. The juvenile correctional facility where Ryan Patterson would spend the foreseeable future sat on the outskirts of a town that most people had never heard of. It was a sprawling complex of gray buildings surrounded by chain-link fences topped with razor wire, a place designed to contain young offenders while theoretically preparing them for eventual reintegration into society. Ryan arrived in a transport van with barred windows, his wrists and ankles shackled, his navy suit replaced by an orange jumpsuit that stripped away any remaining illusion of normalcy. As he was processed through intake, photographed, fingerprinted, and assigned a number that would define him for years to come, the reality of his situation finally settled into his bones. He was not special here. He was not clever or charming or untouchable. He was simply another inmate in a system designed to contain people exactly like him. The first weeks of confinement confinement broke Ryan in ways that the trial had not. He was assigned to a high-security unit reserved for offenders whose crimes warranted extra supervision and whose psychological profiles suggested elevated risk. His cell was small and bare, containing only a bed, a toilet, and a desk where he was expected to complete educational assignments. He was allowed 1 hour of recreation per day, spent in a concrete yard under the watchful eyes of guards who had seen everything and were impressed by nothing. The other inmates, some of whom had committed crimes that rivaled his own, showed him no deference or fear. Here, his manipulations had no currency, his charm had no audience, his arrogance had no room to breathe. For the first time in his life, Ryan was completely and utterly powerless. The mandated therapy sessions began almost immediately. Dr. Samuel Chen, a forensic psychologist who specialized in juvenile offenders with antisocial traits, was assigned to Ryan's case. Their first sessions were predictably unproductive. Ryan attempted to manipulate Dr. Chen the way he had manipulated everyone else, deploying charm and deflection and feigned cooperation. But Dr. Chen had spent 20 years working with young people who believed themselves smarter than the system, and he saw through Ryan's performances instantly. He confronted the boy directly, pointing out the patterns of behavior that had led him to this place, the masks he wore, the emptiness behind his eyes. It was uncomfortable and painful and infuriating, and slowly, over months of persistent intervention, something began to shift. The walls Ryan had constructed around his psyche started to develop cracks. The breakthrough came on an otherwise unremarkable afternoon, 6 months into Ryan's confinement. Dr. Chen had been discussing Lily, pushing Ryan to confront the reality of what he had taken from the world. He showed Ryan photographs of his sister, the same images that had been displayed during the trial. He asked Ryan to describe what he saw. For the first time, Ryan didn't offer a rehearsed response or a calculated deflection. He looked at the smiling baby in the photograph, and something in his expression crumbled. Tears began streaming down his face, silent at first, then accompanied by sobs that shook his entire body. He said her name over and over, his voice breaking with each repetition. It wasn't a performance. It was the first genuine emotion Ryan had displayed since the day he was arrested. Dr. Chen watched carefully, knowing that this was only the beginning of a long and uncertain journey, but recognizing it as a necessary first step. The Patterson family moved forward with the painful process of rebuilding their shattered lives. Sarah returned to work at the hospital, finding solace in caring for others even as her own wounds remained raw. Michael reduced his travel schedule permanently, unwilling to miss any more moments with the family he still had. They attended grief counseling together, learning to communicate in ways they had never managed before. They held a memorial service for Lily on what would have been her first birthday, gathering with grandparents and friends in a park where butterflies danced among spring flowers. Photographs of Lily were displayed on easels, and guests shared memories of the brief time she had touched their lives. Sarah read a poem she had written for her daughter, her voice steady despite the tears that never quite stopped. It wasn't closure, because closure was impossible, but it was a beginning. The house on Maple Drive was eventually sold. Sarah and Michael could not bear to remain in the place where their daughter had died, and their son had been revealed as a monster. They moved to a smaller home in a neighboring town, close enough to maintain connections with family and friends, but far enough to escape the constant reminders of tragedy. The nursery was packed up by professional movers who worked in respectful silence, transferring Lily's belongings into storage boxes that would remain sealed for years. Some items were donated to families in need. Others were kept as precious relics of a life cut impossibly short. The pink blanket that had been Lily's constant companion was wrapped carefully and placed in a cedar chest, where it would remain as a tangible connection to a daughter who would never be forgotten. Ryan Patterson would remain in the juvenile correctional system until his 18th birthday, at which point his case would be reviewed for possible transfer to adult facilities. The road ahead was long and uncertain. His psychological treatment would continue for years, with no guarantee of success. The traits that had led him to commit his crime were deeply ingrained, resistant to change, and unpredictable in their expression. But the system would try. Dr. Chen would try. And somewhere within the walls Ryan had built around his humanity, a part of him was beginning to try as well. Whether redemption was possible for someone who had done what he had done remained an open question, but the effort to find out was itself a form of justice, an acknowledgement that even the most broken among us deserved the chance to become something better. The gavel had fallen, the sentence had been pronounced, and in the silence silence that followed, the slow work of healing had finally begun. He thought his age would protect him. He thought his charm would save him. He thought the world would bend to his will simply because he believed himself special. But the evidence was undeniable. The journal told his secrets. The footage captured his indifference, and the judge saw through every mask he wore. Ryan Patterson walked into that courtroom believing he was untouchable. He left in shackles, his arrogance shattered, his future rewritten by consequences he never imagined. Lily Patterson never got to take her first steps or speak her first words, but her memory will endure forever, and the brother who stole her life will spend years contemplating the weight of what he destroyed. Justice always finds its way. The gavel proved it. If you believe justice was served, make sure others see this story too. Subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments below.